We're up to 51. Welcome everybody to Coaches for Change. And we have a special guest tonight, obviously someone who's been in law enforcement in one regard or another for 28 years as a police officer, a state trooper, a federal agent with ATF, undercover as a special agent as well. So much knowledge. And obviously now he's the chief security officer at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He's an expert commentator and analyst for various national media outlets, CNN, ABC, Fox, NBC, CBS, adjunct professor at FDU, taught crisis communication and leadership, and now he's an expert advisor with the Hetty group, which is really dealing with public safety, community engagement, and strategy. And they're a great firm, and Florence is here representing them as well. So we welcome her. And without further ado, you know, Matthew Horace is a gentleman who also played football at Delaware State, was all conference, had a tryout with the New York Giants. And then he did something that he really didn't think he was ever going to do, and that was join law enforcement. And, you know, he grew up in Philadelphia, and it's just so many great stories. I hope you all had a chance to read the ebook he sent. I actually downloaded the book on Audible so I could listen to it as I went for my runs on vacation. And just really excited to introduce Matthew Horace, our guest speaker tonight at Coaches for Change. So without further ado, Matthew.
Hey, thank you so much, Coach. I really appreciate it. You know, it's interesting. It's difficult for me sometimes. And I know I'm very comfortable. I feel like I'm in a safe space when it comes to coaches, because coaches have been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. It does get somewhat emotional because even when I still talk to my college football coach, we have these heart-to-heart discussions, and it always ends with us both having sort of like a tear in our eye because he's meant so much to me and because he's so very proud of me and my accomplishments. So I wish you all would bear with me as we roll through this evening, but it's very important that we relate to each other at that level where you are. And I know all of you care very, very deeply about your athletes. And I care deeply about your athletes. When someone says that they're a college athlete, you know, I just pay attention, having gone through that. In my career in government, I have hired literally hundreds of ex-NCAA athletes. And I used to tell people when I was in Newark and Denver and other places, if you see someone's an ex-NCAA athlete, you make sure that I'm included in that interview. And when we have that interview, I ask those questions, hey, what do you remember most about being there and what did you learn and all those things? And I know that there's some resonance between them and I. But let's begin at the beginning. Every September, I can't help but think of a lot of my teammates. And like many of you, in August, I start to smell the pads. The smell of the locker room comes back. And I feel like somebody's going to yell at me and say, line up for gassers, Horace. And even though I haven't done that in quite some time, as we move into September and 9/11, I can't help but think about one of my teammates and the sort of things that you all preach every day and work towards. One of my teammates, his name is Keith Glasgow. He was from New York and I'm from Philadelphia. We had a whole lot in common. He was one of these players that I started at Delaware State for 4 straight years, redshirted 1 year, started a 5th year. He was one of these players that never worked his way into the starting lineup. I was a guard in the center and he was a defensive end. And what I remember about him the most is that I hated when he was on the field because he always got me yelled at. He came at you relentlessly, play after play. He never took a play off, but he never made it into the starting lineup. And I think during my senior year, he actually made the road, the travel team. We got to know each other fairly well. We lived on the same hallway in the dormitories. And I didn't think too much about it while he was there, but as the coaches are telling you that everybody has a role to play, as you all do, everyone has a role to play on the court or on the field. I never thought a whole lot about it, but when we both graduated together, I had realized that, man, he played in like 4 games in 4 years. But every time he was on the field at practice, he made us all look really bad. And looking back on it, I still don't remember what it was about him that didn't allow him to get pushed up. I mean, we had some really good players. You know, we had a couple guys get drafted along with myself getting a tryout. But he never stopped. He never quit. He learned something from the program. And during the time I was at DSU, we were 2-9 as a freshman, and I was 9-2 as a senior. So every one of you on this call knows what went into that transition and the type of work that was involved. He was a relentless football player. And on 9/11, he was one of the New York City firemen that got called to the Twin Towers. And he did exactly what public safety people do. He ran into buildings that no one would run into. He did things that no one would do. He gave his life on 9/11, running up into the Twin Tower. And I'll never forget him as a football player or as a teammate, because I know that what you all are telling kids matters. And it matters not only to what you tell them when they're on the court or on the field, but also in life. And that's what you're trying to build. But the other thing it reminds me of is it reminds me of the importance of public safety, whether it's being a fireman or being a police officer, being a nurse, everybody at the front lines gives of themselves in a big way. And when I wrote this book, it wasn't about talking about all the great things that law enforcement does. The book was about talking about the bad things, the dark side, what people should know, and how to keep people safe. So at the end of the day, my goal and your goal is to make sure that our kids come home safe at night and that they know what to do when and if they have interactions with law enforcement. And as we have this time tonight, we're going to talk about some of the things that have happened, actually, not just to myself, but to others throughout the history. So why am I here? I had that awesome opportunity to play. As you all are telling your athletes every day of every week of every year, you got a tremendous opportunity to be on scholarship, play the sport you love, excel at doing it, why you're special. I was told I was special so many times. I really started to believe it at some point in time. And I knew every day of the week that when you have a 40-inch waist and a 56-inch chest, that people see you and they know that you're not on the corner, you're not in a gang, you're not shooting dice, you're not drinking beer on the corner. And as the coaches would always say, you're doing something really special. And I really engaged it. I listened to it each and every day. Then you go throughout life. I have 2 children. My daughter just graduated from West Point. She was the captain of the volleyball team for 2 years. My son plays lacrosse at West Point now. And they're both having that same experience that I did, right? So I don't know if it's in the DNA or if it's just something we're feeding the kids here, but I'm enjoying watching them go through it. But this is how I got here. And this is why we're here tonight. My son's coach at West Point, Coach Horace, great guy. They have a great program at West Point in lacrosse. He had read the book and he said, Maddie, can you have your dad call me? You know, I like to talk to him. I like to have him speak to the team. And I spoke to Coach Horace and he said, listen, I need you to talk to my kids. He says, I have 90 kids. I have 3 African-Americans on the team. He says, and quite frankly, he says, I've never felt more insecure. We had this George Floyd incident. He says, I thought that at West Point lacrosse, we were doing it all right. And the reason why I thought we were doing it all right is because none of the kids came to me and said anything. He said, the white kids didn't ask any questions. The black kids didn't ask any questions. He said, I hadn't even spoken to our team. I just assumed that everybody was okay. And he said, after reading the book, I knew we had to open up some dialogue. And I needed to get closer to my kids in a whole different and unique way. So we had a session with the lacrosse team, and the session was supposed to go an hour. It went 2 hours, and the kids had all kinds of amazing questions. And I spoke to Coach Horace today, and he said, you know, I would have to think that there are some coaches out there somewhere in some sport that are just thinking that everything's okay with all their kids, and it's really not. So the idea is that coaches play a very, as you all know it, a very influential part in kids' lives. And you spend your blood, your sweat, and your tears making great students, great athletes, and great people. And what you do and say can and will influence them for the rest of their lives. I still remember to this day, and I'm 56 years old, I remember some of the things my coach said on different days at practice, before and after games. So what you're doing is educating our college athletes on the importance of voting. It's just immeasurable. And the fact that you're able to align voting to social justice for our next generation of leaders is brilliant. And I think it's brilliant because many times we don't have these discussions. And as you all know, your vote is your voice. And when you think about talking about kids about being special and what they're doing and their impact, there are 460,000 student athletes in the United States. Almost 500,000. So in my view, we really can't ignore the moment. Now is the time. And if not now, then when? And if not by you, then who? So let's think about managing these diverse teams with kids from all walks of life, different neighborhoods, Watts and Philly and New York and Baltimore, suburban and urban and country. They come together and we teach them how to win and how to be better people. But do we talk to them about this uncomfortable issue of social justice? I'm here to tell you that these incidents that we hear about, and we're going to talk about a couple of them, they can, they will, and they do happen to people who you all care the most about. So I talked about being special. You know, you listen to that long enough, you start to believe it. And then when I got in government, my title changed to special agent. I used to tell people I was special a long time before I got to the government. My college coaches told me I was. They told me I was better than everybody else back in Philly that was going nowhere fast, that I would be moving in a different direction. On May 31st, 1982, I left my parents' home to go downtown in Philadelphia to celebrate the Philadelphia 76ers, one of their many championships. And as soon as I exited from the subway, I saw a Philadelphia police officer with a canine running in my direction. I did not know why. I'd never been approached by police, never arrested or anything. And what happened in the next 10 seconds sort of changed my life and my perspective forever. I was bitten by the dog. The cop used an expletive and told me to get the you-know-what out of here. He didn't stop and give me aid. He didn't arrest me. He didn't interview me. And I was left on the street in Philadelphia bleeding. At some point, some members of the public and some Philadelphia police officers responded and took me to the hospital. What we learned after my 2-week hospital stay, which included an infection, was that, number one, the canine officer never reported the bite, which is against all policy anywhere in law enforcement. We learned, number two, that the officers that had taken me to the hospital listed in an official report that I was a suspect and not a victim. And number two, that they didn't know the origins of my injury. And we all know that that was practically impossible. That was my first experience, my first real interaction with police on any official level. I was upset because I thought my scholarship was at risk. I felt like I might never play football again, and I didn't know what was going to happen next. Well, what I didn't know was how utterly, emotional my college coach was going to be about it and how he felt about it. And the way he responded to it taught me a whole lot about coaching and playing and how much coaches care for their players. Well, this wasn't the only incident to ever happen to a college athlete, for sure. You all know that when they leave your campuses and go back to their homes, wherever they live, you sort of lose some control. And I know when I was in school, my coach's perspective was, if I can keep the kids here for the summer, working out and being a lifeguard and working out and staying here, I can sort of control what happens to them in some regard. Well, we moved on past that. And at some point, I decided that I wanted to be a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. I entered what I believe to be one of the most noble professions on earth in law enforcement. And I rose to the ranks in federal law enforcement and retired as a senior executive. But along the way, I learned some lessons behind the scenes that really caused us all to pause. And some of those lessons really get into why we're here today, and some lessons we can learn both from the book and from that active bidirectional feedback that you can have with your players, but also with your coaches. Yesterday, I spoke to a coach in the Big 12, and he's not on the call. He's not in the organization yet. But he told me he grew up in Chicago, and he went to Catholic school before he was recruited to play football. And he said, I asked him, what is your most significant memory about growing up in Chicago and discrimination and racism? And he said, I still hear this sound in my head, click, click, click. And I didn't realize until recently what it really meant. But he told me that the click, click that's in his head and in his memory had to do with vehicles that pulled up in front of this Catholic school, and people would click their car doors shut way back in the day when you heard that clicking sound. And he said he never forgot it. So when he had the discussion with his coaches, at his university, it was sort of emotional, and the coaches never thought about it. They said, I never thought about anything like that. So what I'm going to do now is read to you just a couple sections of the book, and many of you have already read it, but I just want to use this as sort of an opportunity to open the dialogue and open the aperture of understanding. Within the ranks of law enforcement lurks the dated and dangerous concept that cops don't tell on cops. Like other Black men, I feel the frustration, the humiliation, the fear, and the rage, just knowing that I'm at risk for doing nothing more than breathing. As a Black man, I brace myself through every police encounter, whether I'm a corporate executive, cafeteria worker, or computer geek, school teacher, US senator, professional athlete, architect, or even a cop. As a career African-American law enforcement officer, I've literally lived on both sides of the barrel. My finger on the trigger 1 second away from using deadly force in one case, and in the next, as a Black man with a police officer's gun pointed at my face. A lot of what we're dealing with today is fear. In my book, we talk about the boogeyman and this inherent fear that America can have of Black men and to some extent, Black women. How that impacts us in our roles and your roles is we're training and coaching and mentoring some of what can be perceived as some of the most intimidating people on earth. How do people respond when someone is 6'5", 320 and they get out of a car? How do police respond when they go to a party and people are running away and they speak to someone who's 6'10", 290? Fear creates problems, and problems many times creates death. I'm going to read another section to you. This is a roundabout way of explaining how I come to this moment in time where I might have to shoot someone. If I thought Leslie was big sitting down, he was a mountain standing up, at least 6'8" and well over 300 pounds. I thought I was buff, but I was nothing compared to him. My partner and I knew that we'd be hard pressed to arrest Leslie without additional support based solely on his size. I had resigned myself to the fact that once we put hands on this very large man, if non-compliance continued, lethal force might be necessary. We had choices to make. If we tried to hand him physically, we could both be hurt badly. If we had pulled our weapons at this point, our actions likely would have been defensible. And if at some point in the struggle, we had to shoot Leslie, we probably would have been justified. And listen to this. I feared for my life would have been my defense, and it would have been reasonable, though not completely accurate. That's what we're told to say when things go awry. You learn it in the police academy, and it becomes the mantra of every officer when any shootings occur. And who can prove you weren't in fear for your life, even if the fear was caused by something improper that you did? So how does this impact our athletes? And what have we seen happen time and time again? And how have athletes been impaired? Well, you heard my perspective, but listen to the perspective of someone else. The following year, an unarmed Black man and an unarmed Black woman were shot and killed by police in the same week in separate and suspicious incidents. What was so striking was not the circumstances, but who they were in the community. Robert Russ was an honor student and a star football player for prestigious Northwestern University in nearby Evanston, Illinois. He was unarmed inside of a vehicle. A Chicago jury awarded Russ's 4-year-old son $9.6 million after finding that the officer who shot him acted willfully and wantonly in causing his death. Imagine the heartbreak of all the athletes and coaches and friends and teammates and colleagues of Mr. Russ's. Think about Dan Roy DJ Henry Jr., an African-American football player at Pace University in New York. He was shot and killed in 2010 by a white New York police officer, and his parents accepted a partial $6 million settlement. Think about Jonathan Farrell, a former football player at Florida A&M, who after having a near-death accident in a community, went to a home and knocked on the door. The police were called, and when they responded, an interaction occurred and he was shot and killed. These are not incidents that don't happen to people who look like me or people who are important to you. So what are our goals? Our goals are simply to teach and educate both athletes and coaches on social justice, and to try to create a safe space for expression, dialogue, and open discussion, to better engage the student athlete on civil discourse so they're motivated to vote, but also they know what their role can be in being a more productive community member. And then finally, to create greater empathy and compassion in all of us. I know Coach Alparisi told me he had no idea until reading this book of the things that African-American kids have to deal with. And before we open it up for questions, I'm going to share with you a bit of the epilogue. And I don't know if anyone made it to the epilogue, but the epilogue, in my view, is really important for several reasons. Number one, because when you listen to all the people yelling and no one is listening to the facts and the impact, sometimes things get lost. And I hear things like, that was then, this is now. No one's at risk right now because this is not really happening. Well, you don't have to worry, Matt, because you're a whatever. Well, you heard my story earlier about being attacked as an athlete. 60 miles south of my home is a small municipality in New Jersey called Bordentown Township. The population is 11,000. Two very important things that happened there in 2016. One alarmed me, the other gave me hope. The first was the arrest of the town's former police chief, Frank Nucera Jr., who had just stepped down after years on the force. Nucera was charged by the FBI with committing a federal hate crime and violating a person's civil rights while he was chief. Nucera, I would learn, is a confirmed racist. Once, when discussing a situation where he believed an African-American had slashed the tires on a patrol cruiser, he told a fellow officer, "I wish that N-word would come back from Trenton and give me a reason to put my hands on them. I'm tired of them. These N-words are like ISIS. They have no value. They should line them up and mow them all down. I'd like to be on the firing squad. I can do it." I would offer to everyone on this call tonight that as long as police executives, and in this case, a police chief, as long as there are people in my noble profession that I love so well, that can use that type of language in talking about the people that we all love and know deserve a better shot, then we have to continue to fight. We have to continue to get people involved with the vote and the political process. We have to be aware, and you have to know how your kids feel, whether they're from Trenton, whether they're from Alabama or Wisconsin or Minnesota even. How do they feel about what's happening now in social justice? What's happened in their lives that impact what happens with you and them in your relationship? And then finally, the question can be asked, just as Coach Albarisi said to me, that if you don't know what's in these kids' minds, are you really getting to them at a place that's going to benefit you, your program, and them? So I would love to hear feedback on the book or questions about the book. We're working with the Hetty group in talking to more sports programs. I thank my alma mater, Delaware State University, the athletic director there. She went out early on and they purchased 400 books for all the student athletes. And now we're in the process of scheduling book talks and discussions with the athletes about their experiences and how you get closer. But I tell you, what I really learned in talking to many coaches, both at DSU and other schools so far, that even in your coaching staffs, everybody brings a different perspective. So I look forward to hearing back from you all and being available to you all as much as you would like and opening up the aperture of discussion. So thank you for this 30 minutes of time. I could talk about this for hours. We could do book reads for hours, but I know we don't have a lot of time. But I'd love to hear your perspective on the read so far and maybe some of the challenges you're having in reaching your kids during this very, very challenging time.
Well, I'll start it off, Matt. Obviously, Carm here. And, thank you so much. And Florence and Akash, you're on here too. Thank you guys for hooking us up because, I think this is what we're trying to do in Coaches for Change is just, one of our 4 pillars is about education. But, for you, Matt, you know, obviously I'm not going to lie. I'm probably 3/4 through the book, and I just found myself having to rewind and listen again to fully comprehend some of the things. And, you know, like for instance, what you went through with getting stationed in Alaska, you know, and knowing you were put there basically to fail, and how you kind of overcame that. I think that's, you know, a credit to your character as a human being, and not just a black man that was put in Alaska to fail. But, you know, how did you handle that internally, you know, knowing that they were stacking the deck against you? And then, you know, what would you say the best way to navigate some of these issues, besides, you know, talking to the head of police within each of our counties and getting to know the attorney general and people in Congress? I mean, because we want to enact real change, and we want to be able to educate our student athletes. I think you know, I don't mean to put it all together, but, you know, I think they go hand in hand with the type of person you are, and then that next step for us to take to try to create real change. And we know these issues are out there. We know our players have to have those talks with their parents growing up as black men and black women in communities where they get pulled over and they have to put both hands on their wheel and they can't move. You know, we as white people haven't had to deal with that. So, you know, intrinsically inside you, you know, what were you telling yourself when you got put in Alaska, and then kind of go from there?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I'm going to send you a copy of an article that they did at Mayo Clinic. The Mayo Clinic has invested $100 million in anti-racism listening campaigns. And I said in the article that I had a unique situation at Delaware State. I played for the first white coach of an HBCU football program. So I had a unique opportunity to hear unique examples of what we were going to face when we left DSU as an African-American person. Throughout my entire career, I've been the only one in the room. I've been the only one in the conference room. I've been the only one on a plane. I've been the only one speaking to a group of people in Montana or Iowa or Idaho or Oregon or Alaska. And once you get to the point where you're the only one all the time, at some point, it really doesn't matter. But when I'm talking to athletes and kids, they need to be prepared for that. And they need to be prepared to do exactly what they're doing in your programs, to like ignore the noise and focus on the end goal, right? Because at the end of the day, and even now, I work for the most prestigious healthcare organization in the world. And there are days when I am the only one at the table. But what I will say is that it teaches you to be able to communicate. I've worked in every state in the United States. I've probably been to 50 or 75 foreign countries. I understand the geopolitical environment in every state in the United States. I understand why people do things they do differently in Iowa than Seattle, than New York and Philadelphia, beyond accents. And it teaches you to be a stronger leader. And your people, you know, I can't say enough about all the things I gained by being a successful college athlete. Your time management, you're fearless, your drive, your ambition. You know, my daughter was dating someone last year for like a year, and I said, what happened? And she said he wasn't ambitious enough. And I said to myself, well, he must not have been an athlete, right? Because we're driven. But yeah, all those things that sort of are part of our DNA, you all are building on right now. I think some of them, my wife would prefer you hadn't built on, but it just makes me the person that I am. And I offer no apologies for that. So thank you for acknowledging that.
Mr. Horace, this is Courtney Walden. I was the strength and conditioning coach with Army volleyball the previous 2 years. So I had the honor of your daughter and got to meet your son as well, just forever. So everyone knows outstanding kids. Everyone knows them as outstanding kids. So can you tell me though what Coach Alberici did? Kind of like what would those first couple steps be for a white coach? I mean, I'm in Oregon now, tons of white head coaches that are struggling. Like, what do I do? What are the first steps I take with my athletes?
Well, you know, he said the first thing he did was start to speak to them after he realized all this information that was in the book. He said, look, I had to talk to them. And then he said, I spoke to a couple of my black athletes, and he said, I was floored by what they had to tell me, right? So, you know, again, he said it wasn't through any fault. He just thought that everything was okay, right? So how many of us really believe that everything's okay just because no one's coming to us saying, Coach, I feel some kind of way? And how many of us really take the time to understand what kids go through when they go home, when they're not in your presence, and even the things that they see on campus, just being them in their different environments. Now is the time to listen. And there's not any Fortune 500 company in the world right now that's not saying we need to listen. If nothing else, we need to listen and understand. I mean, look at me, I was naive. For some reason, I thought because that I was big and bad and buff, that I would never have a problem with police, because sure, any cop that saw me would know that I wasn't a criminal, I wasn't on the corner, I went to school, I had something going on that wasn't what they were looking for. But it didn't save me. And it didn't save Robert Russ. And it didn't save others, right, from the same fate. And the other thing he did was, he said it was important for the white players to understand how the black players feel and some of the things that they go through. And it was interesting. He said some of the kids were in tears because they don't understand. They don't think about it. You know, I have a saying on my Facebook that says basically, justice will not be served until people who are unaffected are as impacted as those who are. Well, how many people really never stop to think? And when you recruit kids and you go into the cities or in the suburbs and you talk to them about all this stuff, how many people never stop to think, hey, I wonder what his interaction's been with police and how he feels about police. Has any of his family members ever been, assaulted or killed or whatever? How many people ever stop to think about those issues? They're very, very, very important. And we and you all have a unique opportunity right now to touch kids where coaches may not have ever touched them in the past. After George Floyd, I couldn't believe the number of kids that were leaving, top 20 schools and saying, you know what, I'm out. I'm going to Morgan State, Howard, Coppin State, FAMU, whatever, because they felt that nobody understood them. Well, what a loss. What a loss of opportunity for them, leave Notre Dame and go to Howard. Nothing's wrong with Howard. I would have gone to Howard, and I went to Delaware State. But think about the impact that has on programs all around the country. So I think we need to open that aperture up. You need to find out how your kids are doing, what they're thinking about. You need to find out from your non-Black players, hey, how do you feel about all this social unrest? How does it impact you? Have you spoken to your Black colleagues? Perhaps having your Black team members talk about it in an open, safe environment gives people a different perspective, so they're not so quick to say, what's this Black Lives Matter thing all about? What is this thing all about? Because remember, a lot of the kids are hearing different, varying opinions from their parents and family members when they go home.
Mr. Horace, how you doing?
Sorry. Is it okay to say something or?
Oh no, go ahead, man. You go first.
Oh my God, thank you. This is a Meta World Peace. Thank you for having me, Flo. And I know you've been doing a lot of great things in philanthropy, and I didn't know what to expect in this call. That's great. I'm gonna read the book too. I'm definitely gonna get the book, but just growing up in New York City, it really is really hard to, for a college athlete, especially growing up, especially if you're a street kid, then that's another excuse for someone to label you a thug or label you whatever. You know what I'm saying? And these type of conversations are great. Me growing up from New York City, and my whole family drug dealers and different things. I've sold drugs and all types of things like that. And but I was the architect major, right? So these kids a lot of these kids are brilliant, right? But they just we don't have these opportunities, and that's the easy excuse for someone to label a guy like Iverson or Vernon Maxwell back in the days, label them some type of way, so sometimes you don't have that voice. I heard somebody say earlier, athletes feel they don't have a voice. Absolutely. I remember when I came into the NBA, I felt like nobody was listening to people where I'm from, my hood, or other hoods. I'm always a street guy first because that's where I'm from. And it's true. But we still go to St. John's. We still go to Catholic school. We still respect, what's happening. But I see a shift now, and I mean, this is a great conversation to have on a Sunday. Would love to support your book and any other efforts. I keep my mouth shut a lot because I don't have a filter. When I get into these moments, I start to say things I shouldn't have said. So that's why I'm not out vocally. I try to do things behind the scenes and do social impact stuff behind the scenes. But I don't really have a nice filter, and I just rather not say anything. publicly at times. But this is great, and I'm just gonna mute myself. And I really appreciate all the efforts from everybody, on this line. This is really, really, really great.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Mr. Horace, I just got a quick question. How do you feel is the right way to go about to have conversations with coaches that might not feel whether they feel it's important right now or whether they're uncomfortable, whichever the situation is? How do you kind of create that dialogue to have, a head coach or an associate head coach to want to actually sit down and have a conversation instead of pushing it off to the side for whatever the reason may be?
Sure. Well, I think the issue becomes everyone on this call wants to have a more productive relationship with their kids. When you do that in coaching, you have better teams, you have better connected teams, and you have a more likelihood of winning once your kids are convinced that you're all in. But when you communicate to people, just remind them that there is a whole side of kids that you're just totally unaware of unless you open that discussion up. And there's a whole side of your team. There's a whole aspect of teamwork because everybody's thinking about it. No one's talking about it. So, the bottom line is two things. We have to get uncomfortable before we get comfortable. And these are uncomfortable discussions, but also we have to have goals, and we have to have we have to have a goal. And my goal and your goal and our goal should be to ensure that our athletes make it home safe every night. And then when and if they have an interaction with law enforcement, they're equipped with the tools to make sure that they walk away from that stop. And we have a series of 10 things that I'll be more than willing to share with you. These are kind of things we tell coaches and kids. When you get stopped, this is what you should do, right? To make sure, because what I worry about with our kids, strong and tall, shoulders back, teeth white, eyes bright. What I worry about with our kids is there's that fear factor, right? And that something they do can be misinterpreted. And then, as I say in my book, I was in fear for my life. And that's why I drew my gun instead of used a baton. And who's going to believe they weren't in fear of their life if it's a USC lineman or a Wisconsin lineman, right? Or a basketball player from St. John's? Who's going to believe that they weren't in fear of their life? We've seen this over and over again. You all have the voice, particularly as it relates to your voting initiative. And you all have 460,000 people to use as advocates, right? People who can read. And listen, look at the demographics of protests over the last 4 months. This is not just Black kids or Hispanic kids from New York and Philadelphia and Boston and Baltimore. This is people from all walks of life who have said that what happened to George Floyd, right, was wrong, and we're protesting against it. And there's nobody that can look at that video and say it's not wrong, right? But there are a lot of people that are still saying, why all the protests, right? So how do your athletes feel about protest or not protesting? How do they really feel about their experience being African American in the United States? Do you know?
Do I know for my players, we've had these conversations now for the last couple of years since I've been here, and our guys got profiled twice in the last 24 hours last year, and one was the night before, and the other one was literally 12 hours later. They came to a workout, and because the door wasn't open and they were standing outside, that cop just pulled up on them. And, I wasn't there, and I ended up getting a call from the players after things were done. But, they're uncomfortable in where we are in the state of North Carolina. We are a college town, and, I think if you go 20 miles north, south, west, east, it's a whole different ball game. And, when we had a discussion our last week about, and for this talk, we had talked about, how do we come up with a plan to make sure that our administration is behind us for when, our student athletes decide to kneel or to decide to do some type of protest. And, I'm in talks with our women's basketball coach, and she's done a great job, and she's putting together a conversation where myself and a couple other assistant coaches, strength coaches, and other administrators are just going to be some moderators to create that dialogue, because they do want to talk. They want to have these conversations, and they just don't know how to do it just yet. And I think some of them haven't been asked by other people. Where they'll have a conversation with me, it's different, because I think, not to say anything about sport coaches, but as a strength coach, as an athletic trainer, we do spend a lot of time. I go to eat with our guys. I go to training table. I'm at practices. They have lift with me. We do rehab. They're with me a ton. I'm sure you remember it as a college athlete. They're with their strength coaches and their ATs a ton. So I think our dialogue is a little bit more open, whereas I think for some players, they feel if it's not about basketball, then it's not a conversation to be had. So we're trying to have this dialogue to open it up to not just our basketball players, but to all the players around our university. And then one thing that our student athletes have done is they've created their own Black student athlete organization that I hopped on last week, and try to and talk to them about, our organization, what we can do to help, and if there's anything they need from us, and to try to give them that support that they need. And I think that's the biggest part that I'm struggling with, is if they don't feel comfortable talking to someone else besides me and I'm not around, who are they going to talk to?
Well, I would ask the question, and this is normally what I say when I talk to the kids and other coaches: are you tone deaf or are you listening? And if no one is listening to these kids, what's their alternative? What's their alternative? Don't you want to know really how they feel about what's happening right now? I would dare say that when you open up the aperture to these listening sessions with your kids, you're going to learn things about them that you may never have thought of, right? And because you learn these things about them, it will enable you to coach them in a whole different way.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
If I may,
Coach V, no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, Matt, could you talk a little bit more about your 10 steps to ensuring safety when you talk to students? Because I think the coaches would appreciate getting a little bit more detail on what that program is.
Sure. So obviously, we have to have goals for our chats with them. And we talk about making it home safely. And there's a 10-step process. Number one, establish a winning attitude. Decide that your life is larger than this traffic stop. And what that means is your goal is to get through the stop and get back to campus or get back home. That's what the coaches want, that's what the parents want, and that's what we want. So make that decision. This traffic stop, it doesn't matter what happens here. I have bigger goals in mind. I'm a college athlete. I'm going back to campus. I'm on scholarship, and I got a long life ahead of me. Remove barriers for communication. And what I mean by that is, if your car is all tinted out, drop the tints down. If you know they're going to ask for your driver's license and registration and insurance, pull it out first, put it up on the dashboard. When the officer comes up to talk to you, let them know that it's right there. If they need it, they can grab it or you can grab it. You all know in sports the saying, the eye in the sky does not lie. I tell people, get those phones on record, put them on your console, put them in your lap, put them on your dashboard. And the reason why is because in many of these cases, what we see on body cam or other video is not consistent with police reports that are submitted. And that may be the only thing that enables you as their coach and their advocate to be an advocate for them in an incident. Number 4, as soon as you're stopped by police, make sure that you make it easy for them to get those documents. Put it on your dashboard, hand it to the officer, or tell them to grab it if they need it. Number 5, when they introduce themselves, listen to their name and repeat it when communicating to them. Establish a rapport. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. I am. My name is. I play at. I play lacrosse. I'm sorry about what just happened. Let me know what I've done wrong so that we can get through this. Once they stop you, be candid. Let them know, I've never been in this neighborhood before. I'm lost. I'm sorry I missed the sign, but establish that rapport so that the officers know that you're not going to be a problem person. Number 7, use your communication skills. Create that dialogue. Keep the conversation focused on you being a student, and even more, you being a student athlete. Sir, you talk about being in these college towns. Sir, I play volleyball here at whatever school. I apologize for the stop, but I'd like to know what I did wrong, and hopefully I'll be okay. Establish a rapport. Be open and honest and admit that you're nervous because of the stop. Listen, I carry a gun and a badge. I am nervous when I see those lights pull up behind me. After 28 years in law enforcement, I'm still nervous. So our kids are nervous. It makes them nervous. They don't know what's going to happen, especially with all this stuff happening in the country now. They're even more nervous. Just tell the person, I'm really nervous, officer. I apologize for whatever the reason is you've stopped me. Number 9, and this is an important one. If you're asked to step out of the vehicle for any reason, do so with ease and simplicity and ensure that nothing you do can be misinterpreted. 2 police officers there, one's 5'10", one's 5'9", you're 6'6", and 280. And they grab your arm and you say, please don't touch my arm. Or they say, be still, and you decide you're gonna walk the other direction. These sort of things start that escalation path, and then that statement, I was in fear of my life, comes into very real focus. Number 10, and one of the most important ones, if anything happens during the stop that causes you to question its integrity, politely ask to speak with the officer's supervisor. If that's not possible, make an official complaint later. Just don't make a scene. Don't make a scene there. If you go back to number 1, your life is larger than this traffic stop. And I'm sure that every single one of the coaches on this call would be their greatest advocate if they're in the right. We all know those discussions. If you're in the right, I'm your biggest advocate. Your goal is to make it away from that stop. It's not to create a scene. It's not to do anything that's going to cause suspicious. It's not to do anything that's going to be misinterpreted. You need to make it back to campus and get back to that sport that you love playing. And we believe, and I believe, if you take those 10 things and just think about them, I want to get back home tonight, it leaves us all in a much better place. And even the worst cop on earth can't respond in a bad way when you push yourself on them and use your communication skills, your character, your integrity, and your ability to come off as a really good kid.
Mr. Horace, Lewis Orr, I'm always concerned, like, my son, he's 26. He had to get fingerprints the other day, and he had to go to the police station to do it. And he's in a courthouse with all these policemen. And he came home, and he was just going to get fingerprints for a job. And it was surprising. He said, Dad, man, I was so uncomfortable being there. I just think for a lot of young guys, their ability to communicate, especially in general, but especially with police officers, is limited. They're just uncomfortable, and they're not used to, it's almost like they got to take a class in it. And then secondly, you mentioned, I'm always concerned that if a cop sees a gun, a phone or a comb or something like that, he gonna think it's a gun. So my thing is, you need to show your hands the whole time, because I just don't want nobody saying, well, I thought that was a gun and he had a phone. And that's one of my biggest fears, because they can always say that they thought something was a gun, but it was a phone, a comb. I just feel like, man, you show your hands, you let them see your hands, you don't make no quick movements, and do whatever they tell you to do. Like you said, I agree. Let's get away from this alive and then able to live another day.
Well, thank you for that. And I know for me, even when I get stopped now, I hate to say it, it's the truth. And I'll tell anybody who wants to listen. As soon as I see those lights on, I put my phone on record and put it right on my console. It's not something I do when they walk up to the car, but it's good. My phone is on and that record is on, right? Because just think about this for 1 second, coaches. Think about this. Were it not for cell phone video, in all of these shootings that we've seen since 2012, number one, the report would have ended with just what the officer wrote. And in almost every one of these cases, the report was different from what was on video. Think about Walter Scott in South Carolina, running away from the police. Had it not been for bystander video, no one would have seen that. Think about George Floyd had it not been for bystander video, we all may not have ever seen that incident. So you have to do what you can to protect yourself and particularly to protect our athletes. And in the book, we talk about Mr. Russ in Chicago. What a horrible tragedy. An honors student at Northwestern. And it doesn't matter whether you're at Morgan State, Northwestern, or West Point. These things can and they do happen.
Mr. Horace, this is Amir Abdurrahim, head coach at Kennesaw State in Atlanta, Georgia, a little bit north of Atlanta, Georgia. Number 7, you talked about using your communication skills, and we've talked, man, at length with our guys about, communicating the right way. And I have some kids, from the inner city of Atlanta, and myself having grown up in the inner cities of Atlanta, your relationships or interactions with police officers can determine how you communicate, right, with different police officers. The one thing we've tried to get across to our young men is that to help them understand that even all the stuff that's going on right now, it's not a black-white issue. It's a wrong versus right issue, right? And that every police officer that pulls you over isn't, a racist police officer or trying to harm you. However, your interaction, your previous interaction, and the things that you come from do determine, how you interact. Like think about what you just said. You get pulled over, the first thing you do is put your camera on record, right? Because of maybe your previous interaction. So when our kids have these previous interactions, and I go back and say, hey, look, you got to use great communication skills, but automatically they're thinking like, look, man, my interactions with police in the past have not went well, so automatically my guard is going to go up. How do we get them past that in order to communicate effectively in the right way?
Well, I think I have 2 answers to that. Number 1, in our work with the Hetty group, a lot of what we're going to be doing is we're going to be bringing police officers in to some of these discussions so that you can hear their perspective. But number 2, I think when a lot of our young people, particularly when they hear people just like me, right? I've always been an advocate. Well, first being an English major, that probably helped, but I've always been an advocate of being a very strong communicator, right? And I know what you're saying in terms of how do we get there? You have to keep hammering it home that, like Miss Obama said last week, I was watching a speech, when they go low, you go high. Don't bring yourself down to their level. First of all, you're never going to win the battle of that stop. You're never going to win that no matter who you're dealing with. But also, I agree with what you said. And my book is not called The Black and the White for a reason, because many of the things we write about in the book happened at the hands of Black police officers. So I try to make it very clear. Every cop that stops you is not a racist cop. You need to meet people where they are and learn how to walk that narrow line. And at the end of the day, every Black person is not out to help you, and every white person isn't out to hurt you. And a lot of our kids know that because their coaches are white. The people who love them the most in their lives, other than their parents, are white, so they get that. But these interactions and experiences in the communities, they just make it a whole different game. Your goal is to get home, no matter what. Your goal is to just make it to that stop. Let the police officer give you a ticket and go on his way. No need to talk trash. No need to assert your authority. No need to say, do you know who I am? No need for any of that. Just get through the stop and get home safely and alive. If you do that, if you do those things, you're likely not to cause the situation to escalate.
Thank you.
Hey, Matt, Carm again. There are so many instances in the book where you have the helicopter overhead with the lady officer chasing, and the use of deadly force and the lack of checks and balances with the protocols. How is that? How did that get to that? How did that happen where there's not that constant teaching of the policies and the reinforcement of the proper ways to do it? Because so many times in your book, you're referencing, hey, well, this is how it should have been done, and there was a corner cut, or they could just use that, fear for your life as almost a scapegoat or an excuse to to kill somebody, right? The use of deadly force where someone's running away from you, you could shoot him in the leg and you're fine. You don't even know there's a gun. Or the person in the department store with their wife, and the wife goes one way and the man's in there and he has a fake gun and somebody calls the police. Is it just that fear factor that people are scared of that in quotes black male, like you described in the book too? And how do we get to educating? All of us on here are like-minded. We're on here for a reason, but how do we spread the good word and educate those that aren't on this call, not just our student athletes, but the others in this world that are not accepting yet?
Right. Well, you all, like you've probably seen those videos, right? Where there's a bike locked to a fence, and there's a blonde white woman sawing off a lock, and people walk over and say, "How can we help you?" Right? And then in the same interaction, there's a young black kid sawing off a lock, and then people walk over and say, "What are you doing? I'm going to call the police." You all saw what happened with Amy Cooper in New York City. Listen, the evidence doesn't lie. There is bias out here, and there's a lot of bias towards black men and to an extent black women in the same situations where there'd be a white kid, a black kid. There's bias, and it's not just in policing. So let's be clear about that. Policing gets the credit because we're the ones who are called, but it's not just in policing. Think about Amy Cooper. Think about that scenario, why she called, how she called. She knew the triggers to pull. So this whole bias thing is something that, and for safety purposes, your kids need to understand this, because there are things that, and let's go back to what happened to the young man in Charlotte. He gets into an accident. Well, what would you have a kid to do if they get into an accident and they're hurt? Except for go knock on a door, right? Now, there are black folks in my life that would say, never, ever, ever do that. I don't care where you are. Find out another way to deal with it. What was he to do but to ask for help, right? But in this case, the person calls the police come and he ends up dead. There is a bias. I think if you use examples that are in the book, no one can question that these are abhorrent examples of things that happen. And when you put it into perspective, they've happened to me. They've happened to me. As accomplished as we've gotten, I've met every living president except for the current one. I've traveled to foreign countries. I've worked with members of the House and the Senate. I give presentations to Senate subcommittees, but that happened to me, right? And if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. And those examples of what has happened to athletes should be a stark reminder that as special as you are, I have a picture I sent to Florence, and it was a picture of a young man when he was protesting, and he's clearly a pretty big guy, and he says, "I wish America loved me as much as they did when I was a college athlete." Think of selling out SEC stadiums on Saturday, but then being treated with that type of disrespect on Tuesday.
Coach, if I may say something, that I heard from the group, and Matt covered the 10 steps to ensuring your safety, when he talks to students. But I heard, from the audience saying, what are those communication skills? One of the things that we're working on is developing specific talking points, so that when Matt is talking to the to students about the 10 steps, that he would be able to give almost like a script. You might not want to say this, and this is why. This is what you'd like to say, you should say, and this is why. So Matt gave us a Reader's Digest version of the 10 steps on this call, but when he does this session with students, it's much more in depth.
Well, that's
Absolutely.
Great. We appreciate it.
And just so you know, I am not in a rush, so I would rather answer your questions than to stay limited to an hour, but I know everyone's time is valuable. I'm here for as long as you need me.
Thank you so much.
Hello, Mr. Horace.
Good evening.
How you doing? Curtis Wilson, Boston University.
Right on.
All right. Just to some thoughts that go through my mind a lot dealing with our student athletes. Obviously, I think some of the situations that happen, I think when Vinny was talking about, Coach Clooney was talking about, him being the strength coach, making that connection. I think sometimes where there could be a disconnect is if your players don't think you understand, so they just keep it to themselves. And what I mean by like these incidents can come up where a young man or woman may feel like they were in the right and the cop was in the wrong, and they didn't have a phone, or they didn't have a, you know, some type of, they didn't get the police officer's name. And so now it's just an incident that happens to them that they keep to themselves, and they just keep it moving because they don't think you really connect with what's going on with them or what's happening when they're home or things like that. And I also find it, whereas coaches, and all of us have probably done this, we talk from experience, you know, when it comes to our actual sport. So you may say, hey, you know, you should try this or you should try that. But when it comes to these situations, if you haven't experienced them where you can communicate that to your players, they just don't make that next step to come to you if they don't feel like you're going to understand. So for coaches that are black, white, you know, especially a white coach, how can they close that gap, because they haven't had those experiences and their players are probably not going to come to them if they don't have all that information we're talking about. It's kind of like, well, let's just keep it moving. I keep it to myself. How can we get that communication to come together so our players feel comfortable, regardless if your coach is black, white, no matter where they came from, that you can make that next step and feel comfortable going to them and telling them, coach, this is what just happened, or this happened to me a week ago when I was driving to McDonald's, or, you know, where they just don't keep it to themselves.
Right. Well, I think the great motto is just like Coach Alberisi came to me, called me, and he said, look, I need you to talk to my team. And it doesn't have to be me, but you have to be proactive and you have to seek out these answers, because no matter whether you're talking to the kids or not, they're feeling some kind of way about it. So I think the idea is to be proactive. You have to go after them just like you go after them on any other issue, on grades, on school. You know how coaches do. I heard this, I heard that. Come talk to me about it. You got to make this a part of the lexicon because it's real and it's now, right? And quite frankly, if you think about the fact that all of us have had coaches, and we think about those discussions we've had with our coaches, 20 years from now, don't you think your players would love knowing that while we were in the midst of the most significant civil rights crisis of our lifetime, that you actually came and had lunch or breakfast or dinner and talked to them about it, and then said, how can I help you deal with this? And what can we do to bring the team together around it? Because I can tell you this, and you all know this, when something happens to someone, or worse, someone gets killed, every athlete who's ever been associated with them and every coach is impacted for the rest of their lives.
Hi, this is Coach Burks, head women's basketball coach at FIU. You know, I agree with what you said there, is making sure that you allow a platform for your student athletes to, feel comfortable and, coming and speaking with you. But I also think we have to make sure that we're walking that fine line of they are not our saviors and they don't have all the answers themselves. Sometimes these kids are processing their own traumas. And for us to, I'd say, coaches of non-color that are going to them, well, what can I do to help you? They may not know. So I think sometimes you do have to draw that fine line of seeking them and letting them know that this is a safe space. But at the same time, you cannot, expect these 18, 21-year-olds who are processing their own issues to be the source of all your answers. You've got to do the work. Which I think this group is great to do, but I think as coaches, we do have to be careful with that.
Thank you.
Mr. Horace, a quick question, and I don't have the answer, but I think especially when interacting with police who have an incredibly tough job, it's hard not to be nervous. And because you get nervous, they get nervous. I remember getting pulled over when I was in my mid-20s, and I got pulled over and I got nervous, and he asked me, why are you nervous? And then I said, I don't know. He goes, have you been smoking? I don't smoke. That made me more nervous. Next thing I know, I'm outside the car and he's checking my car, and I ended up, just getting a ticket. But, how do we help our student athletes with that process? Because it's a natural instinct. And then on the other hand, the police officer natural instinct is he's nervous. Why is he nervous? And I remember like yesterday, he said, you shouldn't be nervous if you don't have anything to hide. And I couldn't say, well, you're Caucasian and you make me nervous in this situation.
Right.
And that's just how you feel sometimes. And depending on where you are in the country, you feel that way more so than in others. I didn't know if you could shed any light or particular information that could help.
Well, as I said earlier, even now, when I get stopped by police, I'm nervous. I still have a federal credential. I carry a gun many times not, and I'm nervous. And you can't be shy about that. And there's nothing wrong. Look, they can say all they want. You don't have anything to worry about. You shouldn't be nervous. Well, anyone generally who gets stopped by the police is nervous. It's not a pleasant experience. I think we talk about that in the book. It's just not. If I had my 10 list of things I want to happen tomorrow, that's not one of them for any reason, right? And for us, it's even more so because of everything we've seen and everything we've known. It's a very real thing. So like I said, you tell the officer, listen, officer, I don't know what I did, but I'm very nervous about this. And you can even say, look, I'm just nervous. I'm nervous. I don't know what to do, but I'm going to follow directions and I'm going to comply. Because in our culture, any measure of noncompliance means we escalate to the next level. And it's interesting. Our profession needs some work. We need some work. And there are a lot of people in it that know it, that are willing to partner with us to get it done. And they're willing to come to these meetings and be collaborative. But I can tell you this, no one hates bad cops more than good cops. And there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of good cops out there, but it makes it very hard when people see what happened to George Floyd to get stopped by the police and not be nervous, So I say to those officers that still use that tactic that they're behind the times. Recruitment, hiring, training, and accountability. If we don't have those 4 things, then we have the situation we're in right now.
Mr. Horace, just to piggyback off of Fred, what is the process once a cop has been in a situation where there's been acts of violence against them, meaning maybe a shootout or something like that? What do they go back to work the next day? Is there a psychological test? I'm sure that these cops have PTSD. What's the process for them getting back out on that field? Because I feel like some of their nervousness obviously stems from some trauma that they've experienced out there.
Sure. Great question. Well, several things. Number one, now, currently, there is no national standard by how police departments have to operate. And many of us in the space have been calling for that for quite some time. So let me give you an example. There's no national standard of how old you have to be a police officer. In some places, you can be a police officer before you can drink alcohol legally. There's no national standard of hiring. In some departments, you take a polygraph, and some you don't. Some departments, they do a background back to middle school. Some they don't. Some departments will accept you if you smoke marijuana or use coke. Some you won't. Some departments, as soon as you have a shooting incident, they pull you out of duty, put you in admin, investigate it, and you have to see a psychologist before you go back to work. In some departments, you can turn down the mental health services and go back to work the next day. But one of the things that does happen in law enforcement, unfortunately, is that in many places where you do get a psychological test, you get one psych test before you're hired. If you pass that test, then you're hired. But then throughout the next 24 years, you're never given another test. So we do have unfortunately, we have officers out there that have PSTD and other disorders that are operating and driving police cars and arresting people and showing up, and they have not dealt with their own mental health issues. So that's a challenge. And just so that you know how bad this issue is, 1 out of every 4 police shootings involves someone who's mentally ill. The mentally ill are 16 times more likely to be shot by police than the average person. Yet, we still call police to respond to people who are in mental health crisis. And just for the record, African Americans are 3 times more likely to be shot by police. So think about that as it relates to the demographics of our athletes.
Mr. Horace, Curtis Wilson again. How aggressive should we be as coaches? What I mean is, if a student athlete comes to us after an incident, as I was talking earlier with the police officer, or and you know, for instance, if that happened to me at home, I'm going home, my mom was getting in the car and she's driving to the police station. You know what I'm saying? Like, she's going. If I said, this is what they did to me, this is what happened, we all know that. My mom get in the car, my dad's getting in the car, we're gonna go to the police station and we're gonna get to the bottom of what happened. You know, as coaches, when our players come to us in those type of situations, you know, obviously we're working for universities. We're in situations where some may have campus cops, you may have city cops, you may have so many different people get involved with your student athletes. What would you recommend as a coach, and my player comes to me about something and they're not happy and they want you, you know, because you defend your players, you love your players, you have their back. That's, you know, recruiting process, you have their back. You know, they're like your kid. You know, you know, where is that line where you say, all right, well, we're getting in the car and we're going to the police station? Like, where is, you know what I'm saying? Like, you know, that line, I think people may be like, okay, that's my boy, I'm gonna take care of him. You know, emotionally, I'll be there to talk to him. But when is there actual action where you, all right, let's go. We're going down there. You know, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that once you've identified as an adult advocate, once you identify that there's something that happened here that was illegal, lacked integrity and character, or has the potential to have longstanding impact on the athlete, then I think some adult needs to get involved. And it can't just be the athlete, it has to be an adult. And whether you work with or through and as a part of a collaboration with your campus police and the police department, or whether you get someone else of influence at the school to do it, kids need advocates and they need to feel supported when these things happen. I would dare say that if the kids aren't coming to you with these things, how many of these things just go by and the coaches never hear about it because the kid doesn't want to say I was out past curfew, or the kid doesn't want to say that, you know, it's embarrassing. But yes, they need that advocate. If it's illegal, if it's against the integrity, the character, or what you're trying to instill, if it's going to have long-lasting impact, if it's an arrest that involves fines and all those sorts of things, then some adult has to get involved. And at the end of the day, when you're coaching in North Carolina, your kid's from New York City, that kid's parents are hoping that you're going to be that adult in those different cases.
Yep.
And, you know, and let's face it, all the times the kids aren't always right? But when they're right and you're their advocate, then somebody's got to be that advocate, because we need the kids who are in athletic programs to be involved in law enforcement. I need those kids, right? Great character, great integrity, fit, tall, strong, fearless. Those are the kids we need in the profession, right? But one little thing, one little skirmish off campus can ruin their opportunity to get involved with the profession that we need them to be involved with. And that's because of a system that's not in our favor.
Thank you.